Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on wherever you are in the world today. Welcome to our INSEAD Lifelong Learning webinar titled Power and Progress, Redefining Growth in the Age of AI. My name is Antonio Fatas. I'm a professor of economics at INSEAD, and I'm really glad that we have Simon Johnson with us today, sharing his thoughts on the role of technology, in particular in artificial intelligence, when it comes to progress, economic and social. Let me introduce briefly our speaker. Simon Johnson is a professor of entrepreneurship at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He has a very long and productive career as an academic, but he's also been a policymaker in many roles. For example, he was the chief economist and director of the research department at the International Monetary Fund in 2007, 2008. Now, he's written a large number of very influential papers in academic research. But in addition, he's also written several very popular books. If some of you have not read a book that he's wrote on the global financial crisis and the role of bankers, I strongly recommend that book to all of you. Now, he's here to talk about a different book. His most recent book, Power and Progress, Our 1,000 Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity, a book that explores the circumstances and the institutional framework that can help societies get the most out of technology, and he will focus on artificial intelligence today. I have to mention, of course, that last year, 2024, Simon received the Nobel Prize in Economics together with Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson. I'm quoting the committee that awarded the prize. The prize was given for studies on how institutions are formed and affect prosperity. Now, this is linked to previous academic work of Simon, although the theme about institutions and growth is a theme that permeates through all his career, including the book that he's discussing today. Now, as a personal anecdote, when I teach, some of you have had me in the classroom, I talk a lot about the role of institutions in growth and in economics in general. And my research and my teaching has been heavily influenced by the inspiration that I found in Simon's career. Now, he's going to do a short presentation. He's going to present some of his ideas to start with. When he ends, we'll start with a conversation between him and I. Some of you have submitted questions as you register. I've have a list of those questions, a very long list. If you want to add questions, you can all go to the Q&A function of Zoom, add them there. You can upvote some of those questions as well so I can see them more. I'll keep an eye on that and I'll pick some of the questions for our Q&A section of the webinar. Simon, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for those very kind words of introduction. Thanks for the opportunity and wonderful to meet you all. And I hope, that, as Antonio said, this will be a very lively and active discussion around the issues of artificial intelligence and jobs and technology, because honestly, I think these are huge questions, and we are working very hard on them at MIT, I promise you, as are many people in other places, but there's a lot of work to do. And I will try to be quite candid with you about what we know and what we don't know. And let's be very clear for the record. This is Thursday, March 20th, 2025, early in the morning in Boston. And I reserve that I'd say this, make this kind of remark at the beginning of my talks, because tomorrow I may change my mind. Tomorrow we may see new data. Tomorrow we may see new software. Tomorrow the world may change again. And so, I think the best we can do is be honest with each other about how we see the world today at this moment, and then discuss what we think can happen and which way we want to push technology, because that's going to be a big part of my message. So the talk, the title is Power and Progress, Redefining Growth in the Age of AI. I give you, we're going to talk about a lot of topics, a lot of issues, but let me give you my one-page summary slide to start. And while there are many different potential impacts of AI on the world and on all of us, the one that we focus on in our research, and I'll talk about who we are in a moment, but what we focus on is jobs, because we think that what happens to jobs, who has a good job, who doesn't have a good job, is the key determinant of, well, many things, including human fulfillment, the structure of society, and of course, inequality. And in the United States today, you can tell me how it is in your countries, but in the United States, there are two really clearly defined, rather different views about the future of AI. One is, I think, fairly regarded as techno-optimism, and that is that AI will be so amazingly transformational and bountiful that you really won't have to work anymore. There'll be massive productivity gains. And then the question will be, what sort of universal basic income system do we want to put in place? The second view is much more pessimistic. In fact, I think we can call it techno-pessimism, actually. which is that this rapid automation the software will bring, and I'll talk quite a lot about that, that's going to create a lot of unemployment with almost nobody getting a job. And there will be a pervasive de-skilling of previously well-paid jobs, which might be analogous to what we saw at the beginning of the British Industrial Revolution, when textile machinery first came into action. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Our view, to be completely candid, is neither one of those. We think that the AI effect on, for example, US productivity growth around the world is a bit more complex, but US productivity growth we think will remain roughly where it is now. So in other words, the trend doesn't change. Now, AI will be part of how that trend continues, but it's not going to be a massive jump upwards in productivity. However, we think that AI is going to have first order effects potentially on the job market, particularly exacerbating and continuing what is widely regarded and called job market polarization, which means that people with a lot of education do relatively well over time. They do better and better. People in the middle get squeezed and pushed down to the lower end of the labor market, and at least in the United States, but also many other countries, being at this lower end of the labor market without a lot of skill, without skills or expertise that's recognized and paid for in the labor market, it's a pretty tough place to live. So the top, most educated people, the richest people also, will do well, probably very well. Middle gets squeezed, bottom gets pushed down. And I think there's also a very real risk. The division of labor across countries will change. Now, there's really big bands of uncertainty around that statement, but it's quite possible that in addition to increasing inequality in, for example, the United States, the advent and deployment of AI will increase inequality across countries and also within other countries. But here's the key point, and this is what the book is about, and this is why I give these talks around the world, because in our view, it doesn't have to be this way. AI presents us with choices. It is a general purpose technology. I think everyone can agree on that. But it doesn't have to go in the direction I just said, in this unequalizing direction. It could become a technology that is empowering and that raises up the wages and living standards of people who don't have a lot of education. And I think that's still before us today as a very important choice. There's alternative paths that we can take. Our concern is that left to its own devices, market forces and big tech players are tending to push the technology in a way that will be unequalizing. But we think people can mobilize, people can organize, people can build companies, people can make money. So this is a business school conversation. And I'm a professor of entrepreneurship, as Antonio said. I've been teaching entrepreneurship at MIT for 30 years. We think there's entrepreneurial opportunities to build alternative paths that are much more empowering for people around the world. And this could really be transformational in ways I think that would be extremely positive. Wouldn't take much away from the top. It would build a lot at the bottom. So let's talk about that. The book on which this is based is called Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. It's written with Doron Acemoglu, my longtime colleague and very good friend. And Doron and I, with David Autor, David Autor is one of the world's leading labor economists. The three of us run a research group at MIT called Shaping the Future of Work Initiative. And we are all about the themes that I'm going to talk about today. And we're all about digging into the details and finding research, promoting research, helping people network around these issues. And we welcome people to attend our seminars. Some are more technical than others, and to come visit us and to send us their research and so on, because, these are hugely important problems. Now, when you have conversations with people in the tech sector, and we do have a lot of good relationships with these people, that's part of what you get when you work at MIT, and you ask them the same question that I'm dealing with today, which is, what will AI do to jobs and to the labor market? The response that you get back, the response that I got from one very prominent techno entrepreneur was, Simon, relax. We will all be gods. This person's view is that AI will be so enhancing of human opportunities that we will literally be playing with galaxies. That was, again, his words. Now, I'm not opposed to playing with galaxies. I agree that the world will change many times in the next 100 years. But I want to drill down into a much more mundane question that I think, and Doron and David and I believe, is central to what happens next, which is, technology is changing in a profound way. Who is still going to have a good job as this technology deploys? Let's dig into that. Oh, I should say, I woke up earlier one October morning, very sleep-logged, and I hadn't got any phone calls from Stockholm or anything. And I open up my phone and I find pictures like this going around the internet. This is a sketch that the Nobel Foundation people put out when we won the Nobel Prize. And well, I don't know. It's a flattering sketch. What can I say? I will make a few points about the research that won the Nobel Prize and link that, and hopefully they'll come out more, Antonio, when we talk, because I do think that the institutional setting for the deployment of technology is incredibly important and very much contested right now. For example, in the United States, but also in Europe, and I think well, we should talk more about Asia and other parts of the world. So I think perhaps the most important and sobering starting point for thinking about technology today and thinking about AI. Obviously, AI has been with us for a long time. There have been episodes of AI development. I started with a colleague, one of the first courses on AI and robotics in a US business school about 9 years ago. And, AI was an interesting topic there, but wow, it's really taken off, obviously, since then and over the past 3 to 4 years. But we have to put that in the social and economic context of the moment in the United States. And the point there is that while there have been some very equalizing and shared moments of prosperity in the United States historically, over the past 40 years, I don't think you can describe it in those terms. So if you look, for example, at the graph on the right here, this is a fairly classic, famous picture now, which was this version's from David Autor's work. David and Duran developed this together. This is change in real weekly earnings since the 1960s by education level in the United States for men, prime age, working age men. And you can see at a glance what's happened, that men who have a graduate degree have done well. That's a lot of growth. But men in the middle, so some college, well, it's not been that exciting, but there's some positive increase in wages there. But of course, a lot of people in those skill levels and those education levels got pushed out of unionized middle-class jobs in the middle of America, manufacturing jobs, for example, and they didn't go up, they went down. And look at what's happened to the wages of high school dropouts or high school graduates. They have, at best, barely moved since the 1960s. Now, how is that possible when we've had so much transformation of the US economy, so much more competition, so many more businesses, and so much more technology, right? And the answer is that technology sometimes can benefit relatively few people. So the jargon for this is skill-biased technology, which means that digital technologies have helped people like me and Antonio and probably most of you, to be completely honest. But they don't necessarily help people who don't have as much education, don't have as much preparation, and as many resources. So what AI could absolutely do, and I think this is just a very simple extension of the logic, is more of the same. That AI could absolutely favor people with a lot of education, people who are good with computers, and a lot of other people could really struggle, or at least have to make transitions in the kinds of jobs they have. Now, McKinsey did an interesting report on this. This is their report, not my report, but we did talk a lot about it. It came out of the McKinsey Paris office, actually, looking at employment transitions and taking, I think, a pretty positive view about where AI could lead us. They feel that employment transitions in the US will have to run roughly at the speed we were doing in the 2010s. So that's feasible. But in Europe, you're going to have to step up the employment transitions to a pace that was closer to what you had during COVID, which is obviously a very intense, difficult period. So even in the best case, a lot of change, a lot of reskilling, and a lot of movement to new jobs. And then, of course, we've got to layer on what we already know has happened in the very unfortunate last decade and a half or 2 decades of the digital transformation, which is the rise of social media, the creation of information bubbles, the prevalence of misinformation, and I'm afraid disinformation, deliberate attempts to confuse people. That's had an obvious impact on democracy. It's also had a big effect on mental health, has a big effect on children. And these are unresolved problems, policy issues, open policy issues, that I think will be compounded and made more difficult by the arrival of AI. Now, this is a more technical slide. I'm not going to spend any time on it. It's about the labor share of income. All the slides will be made available through Antonio's good offices, and there are links and there are citations on all of these slides, and there's links that you can go explore for yourself. The key point is on the labor share of GDP. You can see at a glance in the top right there that this used to be considerably higher in the United States. It's become squeezed over the past, you look at the trend over the past 40 years, but it's not as low as in some countries. So there's no sense in which you can say, well, US has bottomed out. It couldn't get any, the labor share couldn't fall any further. No, on the contrary, labor share could fall considerably further if you look at other models of capitalism and market economy around the world. Now, I'm just going to say just a very few words about global inequality here. It's a big concern of ours. We've done a lot of research on income and growth around the world. And I think we just don't have enough data to understand exactly how AI is impacting. But there are some causes for concern. Now, obviously, over the past 20 or so years, a number of countries, might I say many countries, have found ways to lift themselves up in terms of GDP per capita. And you can see the movement of China, you can see the movement of India. Obviously, that's a lot of people, but other countries have managed to push themselves up the income distribution. But a lot of this is based on exports. A lot of this is based on engagement with the global economy. Digital innovation is lowering trade frictions, so that perhaps will help global trade develop further. Obviously, we're in the middle of a backlash against global trade in the United States. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. That is something we track carefully. But I think that the key point would be if you're running a call center in a middle-income or lower middle-income country, you now have to compete against potential call centers in much lower income countries because AI as an advisor, AI as a language enhancer, AI as a trainer is reducing the barriers to running these kinds of call centers. And it's entirely feasible that call centers will be reshored to the United States, where AI will be handling much more of the routine processes. And then we'll see who handles the more complex questions. Is that AI or does that remain with humans? So big shifts coming in businesses that are intensely digital. And I have to say that while much of manufacturing is not yet extremely digital, there are some exceptions. Car manufacturing has a lot of automation already, obviously, but most of other manufacturing does not. I have some very brilliant colleagues at MIT, and they have brilliant colleagues around the world in mechanical engineering who are working very hard at bringing automation with AI to all kinds of manufacturing operations. So if that happens, what's the advantage of having low-skilled labor in manufacturing? I think it recedes. I personally expect manufacturing output in the US to increase, at least in absolute terms. We'll see what it does relative to the size of the economy. Output of manufacturing, I think, will increase in the US, but not necessarily employment in manufacturing. I think we'll have a lot more automated manufacturing. Imagine Amazon type of warehouses, which you've all seen pictures of and you understand, mostly run by robots with some human interface. Imagine that coming to all forms of manufacturing. You want to be close to the market. You want to be close to the customer. You want to be able to switch what you produce as the market changes. So, and you don't want to drag your goods all the way around the world because long supply chains create various points of failure and points of vulnerability, political and economic and ecological. So I think this is going to be a major pressure point on developing countries, middle-income countries. Now, it's not doom and gloom. I think there's many opportunities here in AI for Asia, for example, the dynamic exporting part of Asia. But I think you have to change. I think the pressure will be to change what you do and change the business model. Okay, just a couple of words on the Nobel Prize work because people are interested and they ask a lot. What we did that got the attention of some very nice and friendly people in Stockholm was look at the historical origin of institutions. So I think we're all aware that the degree of corruption, the efficiency of government, the rule of law vary around the world, and they vary a lot within former European colonial empires. So we dug into the historical record. We tried to figure out why institutions are so different in places that were run by the same empire, within the British Empire, for example. And we found, or we argued that we found a major determinative effect based on the disease conditions faced by Europeans when they thought about moving to a particular place. So where places were healthy for Europeans, they went in large numbers. They built so-called settler colonies with institutions that were inclusive for them, not for the indigenous people, let's be clear, and not immediately and not for a long time for people they brought with them as slaves. But these inclusive institutions prevailed in some places, the United States, Australia, other places. And that turns out to be really important for industrialization and for prosperity today. In places where the Europeans didn't move in large numbers because it was less healthy, you could think about the West Indies, you could think about India. West Africa would be the most dramatic. If you sent 500 Europeans to, sorry, sent 1,000 Europeans to West Africa in 1800, about 500 of them would die in the first year, and then death rates would continue to be very high subsequently. So the Europeans didn't go there, but as you know, they did not back off. They did not leave those places alone. They imposed directly and indirectly institutional arrangements that have proved to be, were designed to be extremely extractive, meaning you get the value out just for a few people. That was the European colonizers in the first instance. But unfortunately, and sadly, and I think frankly quite tragically, a lot of those institutions have persisted. So extractive institutions created 200, 300 years ago by the Europeans have remained not unchanged, but as independence came and as institutions morphed and appeared to modernize perhaps in some ways or become more democratic, actually you retain that extractive structure that the Europeans imposed. Now this matters because if you look at income around the world and you relate it to those disease conditions, the mortality rate that European settlers faced, you find a very strong correlation there. This institutions, protection against expropriation on the vertical axis is my measure of institutions. And here's my measure of GDP per capita. So you can see that while we are not in any way saying that history is there's no predetermination of the world. There are choices, there are policy choices. That's what my research is all about. That's what my career is all about, as Antonio said. But understanding this historical context, realizing what you've inherited and thinking about how to either build on the legacy if you like it or escape that legacy if you find it less suitable. I think that's been the key issue of the past 100 years with regard to economic development. I don't think we invented this idea. I think it was out there, but I think we did manage to codify it and measure it a bit more than had been done before. And doesn't give anybody a magic bullet. It helps you understand the world. And I think hopefully it helps you understand what technology could do next, because what's happened over the past 30 years is while the whole world has drifted up, technology changes, productivity rises, and that's true in most countries as long as you escape civil war and other major disruptions. There hasn't been that much convergence if you look at the countries that had very high mortality for Europeans initially, those that were sort of in the middle ground and those that were more healthy. So we're still waiting for a bigger, broader process of convergence or catch-up in GDP per capita. And a lot of the world distribution of income, to be completely honest and blunt with you, was established in the 19th century. If you go back to the 1700s, and I could speak for hours on this topic, and I won't, because I want to get to the AI. But if you go back to the 1700s, China and India were major industrial powers. I mean, obviously there was less industry in those days, but that's where you had top-end ceramics, metal goods, textiles, and other goods. The British Industrial Revolution starts in the late 1700s. People argue about the exact date. The United States was an agrarian country until early in the 1800s. And it's that mid-19th century industrialization that changed the world, that built on and used the better institutions in some parts of the United States, and that also put pressure on China through market forces and colonial pressure directly on India. Those countries fell dramatically in terms of their share of world manufacturing, as you can see in the chart, and have struggled to come back. Now, again, they can come back, no predetermination. The key, though, to those successful transformations, what happened in the US and eventually what happened in the UK, is the boosting of productivity of workers who didn't have a lot of formal education, creating new tasks that require expertise. And new tasks is the key to gaining from industrial transformation. And this technology, which a lot of it originated in the UK, but really the positive versions were developed further and magnified coming out of the United States, raising and boosting marginal productivity through new task creation, which was complementary to the process of automation. That was the magic bullet, or the really positive transformation of the modern world. And if we want to think about an example of when and how this happened, I think railways are the best case, because railways really changed from the 1830s. They changed market structure, they changed opportunities. The people who built railways were totally stunned by the fact that people wanted to ride on a train for the day and go to the seaside. They didn't imagine that. They actually just thought about goods traffic for the most part. So there was a big expansion of human possibilities. And to run these railways, you needed people with expertise. You needed to trust them with very expensive machinery. They needed to be able to manage one of these engines that was extremely difficult. This was not you didn't need a university degree to drive a train engine, but you needed to be skilled, you needed to be experienced, you needed to be responsible, and you got paid good money. And the same thing was true throughout these railway empires. And if you go on and think about what happened in the US automobile industry, again, I think a powerful example, Henry Ford brought automation to the assembly line. He created a moving assembly line for the first time, large-scale moving assembly line, and then he brought electricity to that assembly line, which made it possible to run things much more efficiently. So Henry Ford and his colleagues and his engineers and competitors absolutely automated using machines. It's very important to acknowledge that. But at the same time, they created a huge number of new tasks. The US auto industry employed about 30,000 people making 20,000 cars in 1900 when Henry Ford moved to Detroit. In 1929, Ford and GM alone made 3 million cars, well, combined, the two of them made 3 million cars, and the industry employed about 400,000 people. Now, most of those people were doing things that humans had never done before. Before 1900, humans did not have those tasks. So new task creation alongside automation is what you need for shared prosperity. And if you look at real wages, you can see the way in which US real wages had risen to the 1950s. You can also see how we've struggled to keep them rising for low-skilled workers from the 1980s. You can see some countries, here's Japan in the middle, rising up successfully towards that level of real wages. You can see the big gap that exists around the world that I'll come back to with regard to, I'm just using China and India to illustrate. And then thinking about what AI is going to do next, we have to drill down into where are the new tasks going to come from. So the good news is we continually create new tasks in the United States and other economies. And my colleague David Autor reckons that about 60% of the jobs we have today in the US, 60% today, did not exist in 1940. So that's good. We need new jobs, we need new tasks, we need technology to extend human capabilities, and that's what it does to some extent. But a lot of that happened in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. Since the 1980s, we have much less new task creation. So the new task creation since 1980, short version, has not kept up with the loss of good jobs due to automation. It's that balance that matters. So what's AI going to do to that balance? Well, there's lots to talk about, and we will get into this with Antonio in just a moment. And these are papers you should go and look at for yourself. There's really good work being done in this field by my colleagues at MIT, also people absolutely elsewhere, Eric Brynjolfsson's at Stanford, for example. So we know that AI can upskill labor. We know that it can help people with less experience and less education become more effective and do things better, and actually in some cases have more job satisfaction. So that's a very positive, and looking for those opportunities and using AI to empower people is absolutely what we recommend and what we're trying to develop further and what we work on with our technology colleagues. And I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity there. So let me emphasize the positive side of that, okay? But we also have to be candid that there are at least mismatches. A lot of the skills that are needed for the new jobs, so this is the supply side of new task creation, a lot of those skills are in short supply. There needs to be a big process of retraining, of relearning, of rethinking how to use AI. And there's some really interesting studies here that I've highlighted by people in the industry and it's academics looking into exactly what kind of mismatches exist and how those can be closed. So anybody who's in a people-intensive business, which roughly speaking is probably all of us, I think that's all of these papers are worth looking at and thinking about the applications and talk to the authors would be my recommendation. But well, actually, on the mismatches, who is at a disadvantage? In terms of automation impact, we can see because we know what AI can do. This can be measured in terms of type of task. We know who has that kind of task because jobs are classified pretty by employers and by researchers and by government. And so when you look at what AI can do and who's going to be directly impacted, the bottom line is women and younger workers most at risk. Now, they may also gain. So it could be that the new tasks that are created are more suited to them, or they prefer those new tasks, or those are the tasks that they're comfortable taking, or they might be better at reskilling themselves to take those new tasks. So I'm not saying that the net effect on these people is necessarily bad. I am saying that the point of impact, according to these studies that are not my studies, but they're good studies by other people, the point of impact is on these demographic groups. And that's important for awareness, that's important for family decision making, that's important for thinking about policy, and that's important, I think, for thinking about corporate responsibility and corporate impact on society. Unfortunately, in our assessment, and you can look at, there's quite a famous paper by my friend and colleague Doron Acemoglu on this, looking at the macroeconomic potential gains and trying to link that to what we can see in terms of microeconomic transformation. And the bottom line here is, unfortunately, there's not that much to get excited about. That I think that the quote, which is from the last year or two, that I really like, that sums this up, and I've talked about it with him. I think John Williams, the president of the New York Fed, has this exactly right. So AI happens, it has an effect, but it's only what gets you to the existing trend of productivity growth, which is 1 to 1.5% in the United States, which is what we've been doing for some long period of time. So it matters. It has a big effect potentially on income distribution and also in empowerment or disempowerment, but it's not going to give you the cornucopia, meaning you just have to sit back and relax and you've reached some sort of economic paradise. Sadly not. And then there's the global picture. So this is the same data set as I just showed you, but looking at nominal wages at market exchange rate. So no attempt to convert for purchasing power. This is, of course, corporate decisions. When you think about how much you actually pay people in different places, you can see, again, the success of Japan and the rise of Japanese wages to US levels from the 1980s, which I think many of us remember when that happened. It was really a striking achievement. But look at where China and India are today. Look at those gaps and look at least in the available data, which is not perfect for all countries, there's a big pressure to move jobs towards lower wage places, and even lower wage places than India and China. And that's now facilitated potentially by these lower trade frictions because of the technology. So we have been arguing for a long time that US policy and other decisions can support what we call a worker-friendly version of AI, a version of AI that creates a lot of new tasks. And we have many specific suggestions circulating with regard to how to do that. And I'm happy to discuss them with you. And none of this is going to happen, not under the current political arrangements in the United States. The bottom line is that the tech sector can do whatever it wants. It's pursuing primarily a commercial logic. It's building software that will be great for highly educated people. It's hollowing out the middle. One CEO talked about the jobs he's removing as cut and paste jobs. Not a very nice term, but it's his term, not my term. So a tier of white collar workers, I think, is going to be automated away. And you can see the agenda of people like Elon Musk, even before he went into his governmental role, as being very much targeted at removing that layer and those kinds of jobs. So automating away those jobs. You can't stop automation. You can't stop technology. We're not anti-innovation. We work at MIT. That would be a crazy thing, a crazy position to take. But where are the new tasks? Who's creating the new tasks? Who's getting the new tasks? What's their productivity in those tasks? Are they going to be paid for the expertise that they develop and need to have to do those tasks? That's the key question. And that's not, I can assure you, on the horizon of current policymakers in the United States. And the US is driving a huge amount of this innovation. Now, China is also very important, and China it's to outsiders like us, we don't know exactly how much will be invented and what will be the logic and so on. So that's a really fascinating wildcard. But within the more open Western market world, we can see that almost all of the investment, which comes from around the world, is going into the United States. I know a lot of brilliant European computer scientists working on the future of AI. Almost all of them are in the United States. So that's a bit of a problem, because that's a vision and a position and a worldview that is focused on certain priorities. And I mean, you might even say a West Coast, the United States type of priorities, or maybe it's even a techno-elite set of priorities, what they care about. self-driving cars, for example. Really not clear the benefits of that for jobs and for workers in the short term. So there are many things that can be done. There can be a shifting of corporate norms. We can change how we treat workers. Workers can upskill themselves and figure out how to make better advantage of technology. We can build companies. We can build companies that counter misinformation and disinformation. I think that's super important. But, frankly, there's a lot of work to do. There are choices, there are alternative paths ahead, but it's not going to be easy. And the natural default of our current political and economic arrangements situated in institutions and the institutions that matter for technology development, these are pushing us towards much more unequalizing and polarizing outcomes. And those are going to have bad political effects, which may be obvious to you at this point, and certainly pretty obvious if you live in the United States. And we can talk further about it. So in conclusion, the book is Power and Progress. It's coming out or is available in about 20 languages. We continue to engage in these issues. We continue to try to develop ideas and frameworks that will help people find this pro-worker path for AI. And we're delighted to continue this conversation with you now and in the future. It is a global conversation. It is a global opportunity. And frankly, a potential global problem, maybe even a really, really big problem that we should confront together. So with that, Antonio, I'll stop sharing and come back to you.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Thank you for your presentation. It was great. I can see lots of people expressing some good comments about the presentation. I'm going to try to focus in particular towards the end of your presentation. You brought up sort of the choices that we have, right? Again, more than the sort of the inevitability of some of what the technologies are doing, but more about the choices. Again, having read your book, there's obviously a long conversation about what can we do to create a direction for technology, a vision, the wisdom of technology to direct it towards favoring more people in society as opposed to a few. Now, there's a lot of commentary in your book about to what extent the civil society can get involved, to what extent, I don't know, the academic elite can get involved. But at the same time, it seems that what we're seeing today in some countries, certainly the country where you're in, the US, is that we're going a little bit backwards in the involvement of the civil society and some of these sort of, if you want, sort of elites that can drive that progress. Is there anything that you're seeing since you wrote the book that is making you more pessimistic? Is this a cycle? Is there a way out of this? Because again, it's sort of clear the recipe, but how do we get to that recipe? How do we get to the right institutional environment to get this done?
Yeah, look, I think we're learning a very big lesson in the United States, Antonio, that I think people in other countries have already experienced, but for us it's somewhat new and a bit shocking, which is we've always sort of, and this is true of economists, it's true of people in public health, it's true of many scientists, that when you have a good idea and you're convinced that more should be done in that direction, you say, well, let's go to government, let's make a policy proposal, and then we let government take over a very big role of financing science in the United States. Didn't have that before 1940. Did it for about 80 years, very successful. And public health was regarded as, well, public health was regarded as being a governmental responsibility. And obviously, economic policy is in the hands of the federal government. And what we've done, Antonio, is create a single point of failure, which means that when government doesn't want to do things, when government wants to go in another direction, when government doesn't care, or when government's in bed with banks in one instance, in 2008 it was a big issue, or big tech now, what do we have? What does society have? Not much. I think, however, this is not the 1780s. This is not the first phase of the British Industrial Revolution, where most people didn't have much education and much money, and what happened was primarily what people with capital wanted to do. We have a lot of educated people. We have a lot of resources. We have been relying on the government too much and believing that we could persuade the government to move things in a better direction. And that hasn't worked, Antonio. It didn't work particularly well during COVID. It hasn't worked for issues of inequality and access to power for decades, frankly. And so I think we have to build something new and more decentralized in the US. And I think we will, because frankly, we've got nothing right now, and it's a shock. It's a very big shock. So we're in a big process of rethinking and rebuilding. And within that, we should use technology, obviously, and we should use AI, and we should think about where does misinformation and disinformation come from? How do you help people to use AI to learn for themselves what is a better substantiated and supported truth and what is obvious falsehood? I think empowering people on public health, for example, Antonio, to me is a much more resilient approach than saying, well, we'll let the Centers for Disease Control tell people what to do. Actually, CDC has not been very good at telling people honestly what to do or what the risks are for quite some time. And that was true under the Biden administration, and it's definitely true, well, under the Trump administration, it's just being dismantled. So single points of failure, Antonio, are a bad idea because they fail. And so we're experiencing a dramatic failure, a deliberate failure, if you like, of government and government ability to shape and drive these outcomes. So we can sit around and lament that, which is worth doing for about 5 seconds. But then we should go off and build some new stuff, because we have these amazing universities. I have brilliant colleagues who span incredible areas of expertise. We know plenty of people who have money. We can organize and finance things. We can build companies, and I think we've got to stop being passive, Antonio, and stop saying, "Well, technology moves on. Inevitably, there's nothing we can do about it." Obviously not. The historical record is technology is all about choices. But who's making the choice, Antonio? Do you want to leave the choice in the hands of a few guys who have some billions already? Or do you want to build something much more decentralized and much more about new task creation and empowerment for regular people? So we're on the second side of that.
I mean, is there an intuition you have about, again, these are examples from your book, but exactly what you were saying a second ago, when you talk about technology and the decentralization that technology might allow us to sort of bring sort of a common voice to some of these decisions. Again, there's the example of Wikipedia versus social media platforms, right? They're sort of both decentralized from a technology point of view, but the outcome is completely different, right? In Wikipedia, you have sort of the wisdom of the crowd in a way that is fairly decentralized. In social media, we've ended up with, in some cases, sort of the richest person on earth, sort of dominating the biggest platform out there. Is it bad luck, or is there something about the technology that makes those two things ended up in such a completely different outcome?
Well, I think there's obviously a lot of randomness, but there's also deliberate choices, and there's a question of, what are your goals and what are your incentives? And as you say, I think the Wikipedia model has actually stood up remarkably well. It used to be, I mean, I don't allow my students, I don't encourage them. Well, now they use AI to do all their written work. And I tell them, don't, in case it's not obvious, don't rely on Wikipedia. But I often start with Wikipedia in my own work, and then I go look at the underlying sources and I evaluate the sources. And I think that helping people develop judgment on what's accurate and not accurate is the right goal there. I think Wikipedia's philosophy has proven to be a very good one, as opposed to attempting to authoritatively tell people it's this way, I'm an expert, or I'm just powerful, it's this is the answer, do this thing. I think, Antonio, one recent example that is not in the book, because we've learned about it more recently, is a very interesting app that was built very soon after the iPhone came out by a good friend and colleague of mine, Michael Minner. And the problem that he was addressing was that when people arrive in the emergency room in hospitals with gunshot wounds or other severe trauma, the trauma surgeon evaluates the patient traditionally and says, this is really bad. Actually, they use some worse words than that. And they order a massive blood transfusion, and the arrival, you need to coordinate that with the arrival of a lot of blood, basically unlimited blood from a blood bank to save this patient. The problem is that when you reach the emergency room, it's often too late. And so what Michael did was build software that ran on an iPhone, a very early, one of the first iPhones, that emergency medical technicians could use to evaluate a patient when they pick them up in the ambulance or in the helicopter. And this algorithm basically empowered the EMTs. So the algorithm is obviously designed and supervised by doctors, and this was before generative AI. But it was a predictive algorithm that said, given what you're seeing, this person is, when they reach the emergency room, they're going to need the massive blood transfusion. So they ordered the blood transfusion and the arrival of the blood when they were putting the person in the ambulance or the helicopter. And therefore, when you reach the emergency room, you saved a few minutes or half an hour or something, and that could be somebody's life. So I think, but the key thing is there, the EMT is an educated person, but they're not a doctor. And this was a decision that previously rested in the hands of extremely highly trained people, the trauma surgeons. And the trauma surgeons are quite comfortable with the EMTs making this using the software to make this predictive decision, and so is the rest of the hospital system and the healthcare system. So I think that shifting who can make what decision, Antonio, and empowering people with a lot of experience, but they don't have the qualification, they were not previously allowed to access a level of resources. I think that's the space we want to be looking at. And I think people are smart and people want to make up their own mind and they want to be informed, Antonio. And I think if you tell them things that turn out not to be entirely true, they resent that. And I think that's with good reason. And I think people need to get better at understanding and educating themselves, which is not the end point of Wikipedia, but if Wikipedia is a step to figuring stuff out and really understanding where's the authoritative sources, what's the basis of this evidence, what do I choose to believe is authoritative evidence? I think that's the best you can do.
I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about AI and sort of the potential effects. Again, I got lots of questions already about that. And I know it's not easy. You don't have a crystal ball. And as you said, tomorrow you might change your mind because things are changing. But that was a little bit my first question. Again, when I was looking at your book, which was published, I guess, a year and a half ago, and I'm sure you were working on it for many time before, I mean, the book has sometimes a little bit of a pessimistic view on how much AI can do for us in terms of productivity growth, in terms of other things. Are your views changing in any direction? Again, today, relative to a week ago, relative to a month ago, relative to a year ago, as sort of more of these tools reach us and reach some of your colleagues and some of the people you know? Is there any sense that maybe things will be better or the other way around?
Well, so we did finish those. There's quite a delay in publication, as you know. So we finished the book shortly. The very last was written shortly after ChatGPT was released, and that was good fortune because we were aware it was coming because we follow the industry pretty carefully, and we were not surprised by that development. But we also, relative to when we started writing the book, ChatGPT was a big leap forward, and I think people have probably forgotten that at the end of 2022. So there's no question that the capabilities of the algorithms, both individually and then if you think about collectively, okay, I don't want to do this in ChatGPT, I want to use deep research, or I think some other software is better. That pace of change is impressive and not inconsistent with what we said in the book, but there's no question that's at the upper end of what experts would have predicted 5 years ago, for example, maybe even beyond the upper end. So there's no question the capabilities are expanding, Antonio. The question is, what does it become as a system of employment, as a system of decision-making, as a system of technology that wraps around society and shapes society? I think there our concerns deepen, honestly. I think if you look at the pace of change, if you look at what people are trying to force through, if you look at the impact of automation, it's going to happen, but it's happening very fast. And, the same thing happened in some smaller sense with social media, that social media seemed great and it seemed really fantastic. And many people thought, well, that's very helpful for the Arab Spring, for example, you remember in 2012 or so. And then we found out it has much more mixed effects. It can be taken over and managed by forces that don't wish you well. It can be used for all kinds of character defamation and so on and so forth. So I think our ability to deal with technologies, to process them and to put them to better, safer uses, takes some time. And this technology is coming at us very quickly. So we'll see what happens in terms of jobs in the United States and internationally. But I think there's just because the technology is moving faster doesn't mean you're going to get better outcomes, either in the short term or in the longer term. It really depends on the processes and the incentives and on the safeguards you got in place.
Yeah, and a follow-up question, which is relating to a question that somebody is asking on our Q&A as well. Again, who's going to get more affected by AI? Again, you made the point in the slide that maybe women and young workers will get more affected. So again, maybe if you can clarify that a little bit. But I wanted to be a little bit of an optimistic tone. One of your colleagues there at MIT, David Otter, I saw him presenting, I think it was a few months ago here in Singapore, and he had a slightly more positive view on how AI could empower the middle class in some societies. Again, I'm sure you've talked to him about that. So again, in terms of this division, what did you bring up in your slide, women and young workers, and then whether David might be a little bit more optimistic than you are or not?
So David, Dron, and I run this research center together. David's a brilliant on branding, and he designed this hat for us, which is called Pro Worker AI. If you come, when anyone wants to come visit me at MIT, you can have a free hat. The point, I think we don't disagree a lot with David. In fact, we write together, and we're writing another paper right now on this exactly this issue. I think our point is that pro worker AI is entirely feasible and should be developed, and we have examples of where it's working and examples in corporate settings, Antonio, where it's a good idea and where company executives are choosing to go down that path. So it's certainly something we're encouraging. I think that there's a sort of a normative or prescriptive part of our work, but I think on the more descriptive part and on the more, what is already happening and what has happened. Remember that the labor market polarization work that I'm citing is David's work. I mean, and the importance of tasks is like David's defining contribution to economics and how that's worked out in terms of inequality and technology and so on. So I think that there are grounds for concern, but there's no reason to be passive or to give up or anything. I think on the contrary, we should be about working harder to try and move AI in a more inclusive direction. I mean, if you go back to the research that Dron and I did with Jim Robinson, inclusive versus extractive institutions was our focus. But you can think of that in terms of technology and how technology interacts with institutions. Is technology spreading opportunities? Does everyone get to ride on a railway? Does everyone people get to build businesses far away from London and send goods into the big market? Or is it more extractive? Are you really exploiting people more effectively and getting a lot of value for the owners of railroads in the western part of the United States and then mistreating Chinese immigrant workers and sending them home and lynching them and so on after the railways are built? I mean, we've seen this in human history. This is not distant history. This is all history of our modern societies. And these are all choices that we make. So let's be deliberate about it and let's have the discussion. Let's have the arguments. I think that's our position. So maybe David and Duran, maybe David and Duran are a little bit separate and I'm in the middle. I don't know. We go back and forth, but we're all pushing in the same direction on this, Antonio.
Let me ask a couple of things about sort of solutions here. And again, in your book, and you've mentioned a couple of those things as well in your presentation. Again, one can talk about regulation, one can talk about antitrust, one can talk about many other things. Now, for those in Europe, again, when we say regulation these days, people feel a little bit that Europe has gotten it wrong when it comes to regulation. There's the Draghi report, there's this pessimism about lack of tech companies in Europe. Now, regulation work well in some areas, tech areas in Europe, like, for example, in payments. So Europe is very advanced compared to the US, for example. But it seems that it hasn't worked well in AI. A second ago, you said, the government is the single point of failure. Maybe this is not the solution. Is there anything that Europe can learn from everything that we're discussing here about regulation and whether there's a way to get it right? And so far, maybe they didn't get it right.
Antonio, I think you just answered your own question, because you think about what has gone right for Europe in terms of technology development. I would go back to GSM, mobile phones. You established a standard early. It was a very open standard. It became a global standard. And a lot of European telecom companies did really well from that, right? So there was in no sense did Europe lag on the development of mobile phones, right, compared to other places. And payments is a very good example also. Yes, you contactless payments, for example, all forms of digital payments. You've again been leaders in this. I needed to get some cash to pay to some tips in Sweden. It was incredibly hard to get cash in Sweden. They don't like cash. Nobody has cash. It's very suspect. So that sort of. But how was this done, Antonio? It was not done by restricting innovation. It was done by saying, here's a common standard, we'll agree, let's work on this together, and getting that through a deliberative process, so there's a lot of buy-in and compliance. And that's what you need to do on AI. So the opportunity the Americans are creating for you, Antonio, is vast right now, because think about clean energy. The world is going to need clean energy. You need clean energy, right? The Americans have just backed out of that. They left you the field. So if you set the standards, build the market, people are going to show up and want to serve that market, right? And the US have just pulled out. Scientific research, we've just thrown a very big spanner, to use a polite term, in the works of the scientific research around NIH and biomedicine, for example, in the United States. The uncertainty, this funding is massively disruptive and really damaging. Again, fantastic opportunity for Europe to move into strategic areas around biomedicine, around pharma, to build labs to show people what the market will be when these biomedicines are developed and so on. If there's a big market, and I say this to my friends in Indonesia and Brazil, okay, by yourselves, you may not be big enough to get the attention of the technology developers on the West Coast. But if you say to them, say, look, we've got 1 billion farmers and we need a solution that looks like this. And if you build it, we will buy it. 1 billion farmers around the world, right? So there's an alliance of farmers in different countries. That will get their attention, I promise you. And this is the same premises when we build vaccines, which we can do and still should do, despite proclamations from the top of the US government. So the best way to get people to build vaccines is to pre-commit to purchase them. If the vaccine is effective, it passes these well-defined tests, we will buy the following amount of vaccines. And you get an enormous amount of, we did get an enormous amount of private enterprise entering when you do that. But what I'm saying, Antonio, is define the market and use standard setting and market definition and market sizing and market commitment, including on government purchasing, to drive enterprise and to pull innovation in. And I think that's what you haven't done yet on AI, but you certainly could. So what's the problem you want to solve? Every sport has its own version of this metaphor, but I'll use the football, soccer one, because that's the one that travels best around the world. If you don't take shots on goal, you don't score. Take more shots on goal. What is it you want to do? What is it you want technology to achieve for you? Don't let the technologists tell you what's possible. You tell them what you want to do. Because, you may not get it, right? But if you don't express those goals and articulate it exactly what you want, you're not going to get it. I mean, you might get it through random chance, but not very likely, is it?
Yep, I like that optimism. Let me ask you a last question, coming close to our end. Again, when I'm reading your book, if I read your book from today's perspective, it almost feels that it's predicting what has happened in recent months in the US, in particular, the power that some tech individuals have gotten in the US, it almost feels like you wrote your book to predict that. Now, you might be happy that you got it right, but you might also feel very concerned about what has happened. Again, I'm curious, what has happened? Has it surprised you, or is it within what you expected as you were writing the book, or have we gone too far, even beyond what you were suspecting?
Well, if you look at we have a number of fun photographs in the book, and if you look at the last one, it's sort of the culmination of the whole story in the hardcover. It's Elon Musk. Mm-hmm. And if you read chapter 2 in the book, it's the story of Ferdinand de Lesseps, who was the legendary, incredibly successful French entrepreneur and politician who built the Suez Canal against the odds. I mean, people had tried to build the Suez Canal for hundreds of years, and Lesseps figured out how to do it. Wasn't that hard technically, but politically and diplomatically, it was extremely difficult. And he was called the Great Frenchman by his colleagues and contemporaries for a reason. And then he turned his attention to Central America and said, you know what, we can bang the same sort of canal through Panama. And it was a complete and utter disaster. But it was a disaster, and 20,000 people died trying to build this canal, which achieved basically nothing, the French version. But why was this failure so devastating? Why did so many investors lose their money? Why did so many workers and French engineers lose their lives? Not because de Lesseps was a fake and a fraud with no track record. On the contrary, he was the most successful builder, certainly the most successful builder of canals, but builder of infrastructure of the mid-19th century. His achievements were legendary for a reason. So people believed in him. And I think that the book, which is about economics and about vision and about the path of technology, is also about hubris, Antonio. Hubris is, of course, something that the ancient Greeks understood very well and wrote about extensively. It's a very pervasive, perhaps perpetual human trait. We achieve things, and based on that achievement, we say, well, I can do even greater things. And we look at people and say, well, this guy built a pretty good car. Let's trust him to do all these other things. Well, maybe that's a good idea for a while, but I think a lot of times it leads to overreach. And there's a reason that the most successful countries in the world have strong governance and good independent boards of directors and audit committees and checks and balances in government. There's a reason, because we learned the hard way that if you put kings in charge and autocrats, sometimes they do good things and a lot of times they do bad things. They get angry, they get old, they get senile, they favor their families. And I'm just talking about history here. I'm not speaking about modern United States, but these are old lessons that we relearn apparently at some frequency.
Mhm.
And I think what's fascinating, of course, is that the modern technology, the latest cutting edge technology, is bringing us back to a problem that the founders of the United States, the writers of the Constitution, would absolutely have recognized and understood, which is autocracy and the danger of excessive power. They could not have imagined the jobs and the technology of today. I'm sure they didn't, just like we can't imagine the next 200 years. But the same issues are with us. We'll see. I mean, I'm a big believer in the United States. I'm an immigrant here. I spent 40 years here, and I'm very happy to have become an American citizen. I worked long and hard to become an American citizen,
Yeah.
and so I think we'll come out of this. But there's no question that the interaction of technology, power, and government in the United States is going to create a very difficult phase for the U.S. and for the world because of where the U.S. sits in the world.
Yep. Okay, we're out of time. So thank you, Simon, for all your insights and your questions. I'm going to sort of stay with some of your optimism and your call to action about sort of what we can do to make better use of technology. Thank everyone, all the audience, for your time, your questions, your feedback is very much appreciated. So if you can rate this webinar when you log out, that would be great. And please sort of stick around for future upcoming webinars that we will be organizing. Thank you very much. And thank you, Simon, again. Bye-bye,
Okay,
everyone.
thanks everyone. Great pleasure.